Welcome to our today's webinar on violence and harassment against women in the world of work. What is next after the adoption of Convention 190 of the ILO? Welcome to everybody. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. We are waiting for more people to get online, and we're doing some troubleshooting with our speakers. So please give us 2 more minutes and we will be starting. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome again to our webinar on violence and harassment against women in the world of work. What is next after the adoption of Convention 190 of the ILO? I am Viviana Osorio. I'm the coordinator of the Women in ESCR Working Group at ESCR-Net. This is one of a series of conversations that we are having to build a feminist vision of future of work. Today we'll be having 5 great speakers. The objective of this webinar is bringing together women workers with women's rights organizations, trade unionists, to discuss the recently adopted Ilo Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 on ending violence and harassment against men and women in the world of work. The webinar will summarize the provisions and obligations detailed in these instruments with a particular focus on what they could mean in practice for women workers, attentive to those with intersecting identities and from groups in situations of vulnerability. In addition, we will be discussing openings for collective work, including next steps around these instruments toward its ratification and implementation, as well as existing and upcoming opportunities for organizing and do collective advocacy and campaigning, including the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence and the Women's Global Strike campaign. So I will be welcome our participants. I will be introducing each of them as our conversation evolves. So each of the participants will be having around 10 minutes each, and I will let you know in the chat when 1 minute is left so you can wrap up your intervention. This webinar is being held in 4 languages: English, Spanish, French, Arabic. You should click in the button that says language in the bottom of the screen, so you can choose your language. I wanted to check if okay, we don't have yet Spanish speakers. Okay, so to start with our conversation, I would love to leave the floor to Marieke Koning. She's a policy advisor at the ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation. She's part of the Equality Department. She coordinates the global campaign on domestic workers, leading to rights and protections of more than 10 million domestic workers and labor reforms in around 40 countries. She also coordinates the delegation of trade unionists being part of the ITUC in the UN Commission of the Status of Women, CSW. So I would like to welcome Marieke. Thank you for having accepted this invitation. I wanted to ask you, Marieke, now that you have been very engaged in this process of shaping this convention and recommendation of the ILO on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. What is this about? What are issues of particular relevance included in these instruments? What are strengths? What are weaknesses in these instruments? And what are maybe next steps and challenges following the adoption of these instruments of the ILO? So I will give the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Viviana, for giving me the floor. And just to say to you that, that actually the adoption of Ilo Convention 190, Recommendation 206, was a very historical one. And that we might realize even more and deeper over the next coming years. But just to say that when we celebrated the adoption of Ilo Convention 190, Recommendation 206, we came there after, let's say, many years of lobbying and advocacy to first get it as an item on the agenda of the International Labour Organization, and then, secondly, to have a lobby and advocacy campaign in place to secure a maximum support, a majority support across governments for its adoption. So this has been really a multi-year long strategy and approach to get where we are today. And all that work and campaign work was initiated by the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, in close cooperation as well with the Global Union Federations, and later joined by many allies, so women's rights, feminist movements, and human rights movements. So, and when it was adopted, there was a majority support, as some of you might know or not know, but the ILO is a tripartite institute, aligned or part of the UN system. So when it was adopted, there was a majority support across governments, employers and workers for its adoption. And this signaled and sent out a very strong and clear message that we are ready to build a world of work free from violence and harassment, including a strong focus on gender-based violence. And why is this instrument so important? There are several aspects to it. As I think maybe many of you have seen, there is so much evidence building up and statistics building up about the scale of women being affected by violence and harassment in the world of work. So there are statistics from 1 out of 3 women being affected by violence and harassment in the world of work. In some sectors, in some areas, these numbers are even higher. It can go up to 40% or 50%. And it's no matter where you are, what country, in the north or the south, no matter what sector we're talking about, public or private sector, this is absolutely, happening at a very wide scale, and it's actually epidemic. And this instrument is very important because it includes a very strong focus on gender-based violence, while it includes all categories of workers and all groups. I will go into a bit more detail about that later on. And also violence and harassment in the world of work differs from other workplace issues. That's why it's also very important. It's often very invisible. It's highly sensitive, generally also an unreported issue, and it affects, again, disproportionately women. It's also a major obstacle to achieve gender equality. Gender-based violence and harassment impacts women's lives and working lives and prevent them to reach economic and social independence. And another thing is there was no international law on violence and harassment in the world of work, so covering the concept of the world of work, with a strong focus on gender-based violence. So this is why it's so historical that ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 were adopted. So what is an ILO Convention and Recommendation? It's an international law, the convention. The ILO Convention is a binding instrument. When governments ratify Convention 190, they commit themselves to applying the convention in national law and practice, and they have to report regularly on its application. And in combination with Recommendation 206, it provides, the recommendation provides further practical guidance to strengthen the national laws and policies. So both instruments, the ILO Convention and the recommendation, are very strong instruments and have a very strong focus on gender-based violence. So and also to add to this, when governments actually ratify the convention and when they have to adopt their laws and practices accordingly, also note that the convention will also provide opportunities to negotiate collective bargaining agreements, so to negotiate certain provisions. So the convention and the recommendation also provide a very good basis for that. And to, for example, put in place workplace policies in all kinds of workplaces we can think of, from supply chains to export processing zones, or let's say in the care sector. And also the instruments will be very important, and some of its provisions have a focus on that as well, on creating more awareness and actually a change in attitudes around the world towards violence and harassment in the world of work. So there's a lot of scope as well, a lot of base for awareness raising campaigns on this area as well. So when we go and have, let's say, a bit of a closer look at the ILO Convention itself, it contains, and this is very important because it didn't exist before. Now we have a clear definition on on violence and harassment in the world of work. So the definition refers to a whole range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats, whether a single occurrence, or so even when it happens for one time, or repeated, and that aim result in or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. It was very important to have one definition on violence and harassment, because the line between violence and harassment is very often very thin. And having one single definition in the international standard also ensures that all cases will be addressed, while, as outlined in that specific provision, Article 1, states do have the possibility to separate the definition at national level. So they can use it as separate definition, but it's very important that it's being captured in the instrument, in the convention, as into one definition. It also includes a definition on gender-based violence and harassment, so together in one and the same article. So that is also very key. Now, the convention speaks about the world of work. So that means that the scope or the description of where when violence and harassment is taking place is broader than the workplace alone. So it also includes, for instance, rest breaks or lunch breaks, or when you go or come, when you are commuting to and from work, when you have work-related trips. So there's a broader scope and coverage of the convention in that area. The convention is also ensuring a very inclusive and integrated approach. So it extends protections to all categories of workers, from the private and the public sector, in the formal and informal economy, and in rural or urban areas. So that is, I think, a very big win that we have secured that very broad coverage. It covers workers irrespective of their contractual status. That is very important too. And it also includes the coverage of, for instance, job seekers and trainees and interns, volunteers and apprentices. And also it includes third parties, for instance, clients, customers, and so on. Now, so further there are very important provisions in the Convention which require states, for instance, to adopt an inclusive, integrated and gender-responsive approach for the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment. So that is an important provision as well, that states should respect, promote and realize the fundamental principles and rights at work. So that includes, for instance, as well, the freedom of association, rights to collective bargaining, but also the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation, with a view to preventing and eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. It also covers the fact that states are required to adopt laws, regulations and policies ensuring the right to equality and non-discrimination in employment and occupation, including for women workers, as well for workers and other persons belonging to one or more vulnerable groups or groups in situations of vulnerability. Now, this is important because this includes all groups. There were big discussions during the negotiations at the Ilo Conference. We had a 2-year process for that. But the way it is phrased here, it means it includes racialized workers, it includes migrant workers, it includes workers from LGBTQI communities, indigenous communities, disabled workers. So there's a very wide coverage, and it actually says that it includes really, truly all workers. So that was a very important element of having that covered in the Convention. It is also covered in the recommendation with more precision on, the coverage of these groups, referring to relevant international labor standards and international human rights. So another important aspect is as well that the instruments cover and include or refer to domestic violence. So they recognize, and this is also, I think, a very important win in terms of the instruments and the negotiations, because it recognizes the effects of domestic violence. For instance, if you go to the text of the Convention in Article 10, there you will see that states need to recognize the effects of domestic violence and and to mitigate its impact in the world of work. And also there's a good, very important reference in the preamble as well in the recommendation sector. And there are also specific references, also to be very clear that it includes the informal economy. There are specific reference to that in the provisions as well. In the Convention text, so in Article 8, and in the recommendation section in paragraph 11. And so there's a lot. So I would really invite everybody to have a more close look to the text of the Convention and recommendation. I will leave some relevant links in the chat box later on, so that you can have a look. What it includes, and also to our latest newsletter, where you have some additional useful links where you can have a closer look at. So since the adoption of Ilo Convention 190 and the recommendation 206, a lot has been happening. And I'm sure that the following speakers are also going to share a lot of the work they are doing in support of the Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. But now it is very, very important that we are very clear in our messages, that we want to see a wide ratification of ILO Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work, and its effective implementation, including Recommendation 206. So This call is very important, and of course 25th of November is the International Day on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, is a very important day, as well other key dates for next year. But it's now very important that we campaign around the importance of the wide ratification of Ilo Convention 190. Now, what is at the first stage we would like to see with our campaign work the first 2 ratifications as soon as possible. Just to explain, we first need 2 ratifications of Ilo Convention. I see I have 1 minute. I will now wrap it up, and then I will give others the floor. Sorry. So we need now to have the first. We need to have the first 2 ratifications, because 2 ratifications are required for the instruments to become to come into force. So that is the first target we have. Fortunately, there are already a number of countries who publicly stated that they want to see a very quick ratification of Ilo Convention 190, including Uruguay being one of the first in that area. So I have a bit more to share on the campaign work. Maybe I can share that later, and I will leave some useful links in the chat box. So thank you.
Thank you for guiding us through the most relevant dispositions in this instrument. This is indeed a very important advancement regarding to women's rights in the world of work. And now to deepen into precisely why is this instrument important, why this instrument really have the potential to make a difference in women's lived realities in the context of work. I would like to welcome Melissa Brittish. She's the Senior Director of Program and Global Advocacy at the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University in the United States. She also serves as a member of the Special Procedures Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls in Law and in Practice, established under the Human Rights Council. So, Melissa, welcome, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation. We would love to hear from you why are these instruments particularly important for women's rights? How may it be utilized to protect women with intersecting identities and women from marginalized groups in particular? How can we ensure that the implementation of such instruments meets feminist standards? And how is Beijing Plus 25 review connected to these new standards? So I will leave the floor to you now. Welcome, Melissa.
Very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the call. I'd like to thank ESCR-Net for inviting me to join this conversation, and I'm really excited to be here along with the other speakers, as well as all of you, to talk about something that is truly historic, like Marieke said. So I will divide my remarks along the lines of the 4 questions that have been posed to me, and I'll try and stay within my time. There's so much to say, so it will be a bit challenging, but what I've decided to do is just highlight a few things that I think are relevant for this conversation, although there are many other thoughts that could be shared, and I'm sure the other speakers will also delve into some of those. So in terms of why these instruments are important, like Marieke said, this is truly historic. And when you look at it within the broader context of decades of advocacy by feminists from around the world to really secure the recognition of women's rights as human rights, and also to secure the recognition of violence against women as a human rights violation for which there must be accountability. at all levels, this is definitely a step forward. We do live in an economic system and model that thrives on exploitative labor. And we know that the majority of individuals working in slavery-like conditions are women and girls. We also know that women perform around 70% of unpaid care work in the world, which means that a lot of the work that women do is unrecognized and is simply not valued. Global standards are very important to serve as a basis to bring about legal reform, policy change. It can also help serve the purpose of mobilizing for advocacy, as well as bring about changes in the public discourse and perceptions, because we all know that changing laws is not enough to really eliminate deeply entrenched structural discrimination and gender-based violence, which exist in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres. I think this is one of the challenges that we face as we try to address discrimination and violence, is that it's so pervasive and it exists in so many different areas of our lives. Just focusing on one area is simply not enough. Now, from a legal standpoint, we of course do have other instruments like the ESCR-Net Convention, we have the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and we have many other ILO instruments that do touch upon different aspects of work and conditions of work. But I think what's really unique about these new instruments is really the focus, which is on violence and harassment in the world of work, and also the timing of the adoption. Because we do today live in a world of heightened awareness and concern about gender-based violence in the world of work. And I think there are numerous movements now that have shown in the last couple of years, and that continue even now, that have clearly conveyed that, we're not going to tolerate this kind of violence and discrimination anymore. That enough is enough, and we do, as workers, want accountability. Now, previous instruments have many important provisions concerning the right to work as well as rights at work, and also, very importantly, the due diligence obligations of governments, which includes the responsibility to prevent human rights violations, as well as to investigate them and to provide redress. There are also United Nations treaty monitoring bodies, as well as special procedures, so different mechanisms that have expressed concern to governments time and again about the range of issues in different industries. And also, they've also made very specific recommendations. And a lot of this work happens with input from civil society. Issues of violence and discrimination in the world of work have also been raised at numerous world conferences and also in tribunals where we've had women come forth and really talk about their personal experiences. The CEDAW committee actually conducted a formal inquiry into the horrifying conditions of work and reports of systemic gender-based violence involving rape and murders of women workers in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico years ago. So there's definitely a body of work that has been generated by different mechanisms. And, all of these instruments are important because while violence against women was recognized as a human rights violation in the 90s, it persists with impunity. And I think that is another thing that really underscores why this new instrument is important. The world of work is one of many spheres where we as women and other marginalized groups have been systematically disadvantaged, discriminated against, and also are excluded when it comes to full participation, equal participation, and decision-making. With these instruments, we really have an unprecedented opportunity to mobilize across different constituencies and different sectors to demand clearer recognition of and stronger government action to end gender-based violence in the world of work with the participation of workers, of unions, of businesses, and of course of governments, as well as a broad range of allies. These tools do not only establish a comprehensive set of minimum standards, but they also provide broad definitions, which are also unprecedented, and they offer guidance to strengthen not only implementation, but they really emphasize the need for accountability, and that is something that we really need to capitalize on. Now, there may be instances where our national laws are stronger or clearer or more relevant because of the context. But there's absolutely no doubt that we can use these new standards to really emphasize the need for better implementation, because we know that we're surrounded by laws that make all kinds of promises, but oftentimes they don't go all the way because they're simply not funded, they're not financed by our own governments, they're not operationalized, and there is such a lack of political will that their implementation is not prioritized. So we can use this new instrument to open up new conversations with those in power and demand that our existing laws be implemented and that they be improved as well. And I think it's really also important to remember that as we do this work and as we use this instrument for advocacy, we must document and highlight promising practices as we go along. And it's very important for us to share this information in order to promote change elsewhere. In this sense, we really need to make sure that our advocacy transcends borders and really lifts up women workers or workers everywhere. Now, in terms of how it might be utilized to protect women with intersecting identities and marginalized groups, as noted by the earlier speaker, this new instrument does indeed recognize the vulnerability of certain groups of workers, but I think we need to expand what this means, and we need to be the ones, based on the lived experiences of women in different marginalized groups, to really define the scope and content and convey the true nature of the vulnerability of these groups. In that sense, it's really important to document the experiences, to document human rights violations, as well as to gather data. We really do have to take an intersectional approach and recognize that there are layers and layers of discrimination and disadvantage based on a number of different identities that are present in people's lives. And I think it's also crucial to make links to other issues and to break silos and to build constituencies to really look at how it's not just work and the conditions of work, but how they are linked to things like sexual and reproductive health, the climate justice movement, anti-slavery efforts, etc. Because there are certain groups that are more susceptible to violations because of where they are situated. And so when we do our analysis, we can't just do it in a silo either. We really have to make all of these different connections. We also need to recognize that different forms of structural discrimination and how they interact, including, of course, sexism, but also racism, as well as political trends that really exacerbate human rights violations, such as shifts towards authoritarianism, anti-immigrant sentiment, the roots of which are often political and very politicized. Another, I think, thing that's very, very relevant to us as feminists is really, in our analysis, being able to explain how women's bodies are instrumentalized and how women's bodies are politicized. And we see this when they are denied their agency and autonomy. So in order to advance in the world of work, for us, it's not just about equal opportunities and decent conditions, but it really is also for all of us as women and others about agency and about autonomy. So how do we situate these in our analysis? Another point I'd like to make is that we really cannot afford to be divided. There are certain issues where there isn't agreement, and even when it comes to certain types of work, I think the ones that really stand out include things like sex work and surrogacy, where there is a range of views, but we have to remember that the cost of being divided is going to be very high for us, and it's going to undermine our advocacy, because we also live in a political context where there are constant efforts to roll back our rights. And so this is something that we have to be very aware of, and I think as we move forward to do our advocacy with this instrument, we may need some new thinking around how we bridge some of these divisions. We have to continue to seek to gain our influence in different spheres, the political sphere, the economic sphere, so we can increase our influence and our say over important decisions that are made, because the denials that we experience, the violations, the exploitation in the world of work and violence, it's not random and it's not accidental. It really goes to structural causes, and it happens by design. So we have to be very strategic and very, it really is about gaining power, because at the core of all of these issues are also power imbalances. So gaining political power, economic power, influence is important. And then I think in terms of when it comes to broadening our constituencies, at least in the immediate future, in the short term, we absolutely have to work with parliamentarians because they're going to have a key role to play in ratifying these instruments. We have to work with members of the executive in our governments because financing is crucial. And I think as we focus on some very specific things like ratification and ensuring that these processes are operationalized with adequate resources, just creating an enabling environment, changing perceptions, and doing that by challenging stereotypes, working with the media, also must be part of our strategy. In order to ensure that implementation meets feminist standards, I think we have to present our own vision very clearly. And in the beginning of the call, Viviana she made reference to, she said one of the goals of this is actually to develop a vision, so this process must continue. It is hard for women to shoulder the responsibility for bringing about transformation, but it's that we need to provide leadership. And it's also difficult because of the reprisals against a lot of women human rights defenders. But I think it's really important for us to continue to strategize and think about how we tackle all of these things as we move along. Thank you.
For a great intervention, and it's indeed very important find a way to keep connecting struggles and keep connecting movements in moving forward the ratification and implementation of this instruments. And for that, I would like to welcome two powerful grassroots women leaders. Firstly, I would like to welcome Claribeth Palacio. She's the president of the Trade Union of Afro-Colombian Domestic Workers from Colombia. Her trade union has been very engaged in the implementation of the peace accord in Colombia, and of course to move forward the advancement of domestic workers' rights in this country and in Latin American region. So Claribeth, I would like to ask you, we would like to hear from you how violence and harassment is currently being faced by domestic workers in Colombia. What are some elements that act as drivers, and what are some impacts that you would like to share with us? And finally, how the successful implementation of these instruments can make a difference regarding working conditions of Black domestic workers in your context. So welcome, Claribeth.
Muy buenos días para todas.
Very good morning, everyone. Could you please tell me if you are listening to me? Can you confirm? Please close the door. Sí, Claribeth, te escuchamos.
Puedes comenzar tu presentación, por favor.
And start your presentation. Hello, I am Claribeth Palacios Garcia. I am president of the Union of Afro-Colombian Domestic Workers, UTRAST. I have been leading the struggle, this noble cause, for years to reivindicate domestic workers' rights in Colombia, and not only in Colombia, but also worldwide. Different countries, wherever we go to, the issue is the same regarding domestic work. Allow me to congratulate that the ILO adopted Convention 190. I believe that this convention may become a fundamental instrument to reivindicate domestic workers' rights. There have been other historically events specifically regarding the women at work, but none of them has had such specific considerations regarding how to protect the lives of the workers in all different working scenarios. I can point out my own sector and the issues within domestic work, and violence and harassment, they are latent in the life of domestic workers. At least in my country, measures have not been adopted in order to mitigate this violence. Domestic work, since you're enclosed, it is a place that represents a very tight relationship between employer and employee. Given this nature, women are placed under high vulnerable conditions. Any physical, sexual harm, psychological harm, all of the different types of harm that we may undergo as part of our work are left behind because there is no one voicing our situation, or no one is there claiming what has happened. So this type of violence does not include defenders, mostly. Now, Article 9 of the Ilo Convention 190, it says item A and B, it mentions identifying risks and evaluating them as well within the workplace. Aside from the research that has taken place in Colombia, I don't have specific figures on what are the risks that we face in the domestic work, but in the Colombian Ministry of Labor, we are deemed as a low risk. That is because risks are measured under other circumstances such as chemicals use or if you are to fall, but they are not thinking of risk coming from physical violence or psychological violence. To this end, I believe that advocacy is greatly needed so that in Colombia, ILO Convention 190 can be ratified. By ratifying it, we will improve violence and its conditions in the world of work. As I said, we lack an efficient instrument. In our country, we have legislation 10 of working harassment, but this legislation lacks a gender-based perspective, which is why it is not approaching domestic work. This is an existing law, but it's not benefiting us domestic workers because it was drafted from an entrepreneurial perspective, not from a domestic work perspective, which is our labor. Do you have any questions so far? Hi. Gracias, Claribel, ha sido muy
Convention in practice can really make a difference in the lived experiences of domestic workers. So thank you very much for raising how this convention would also help strengthening legal dispositions at the national level. Now I would like to welcome Nazma Atker. She's one of the Bangladesh's foremost labor leaders. She's founder and president of Somalito Garment Shramik Federation. I hope I pronounced it properly. And affiliated union with over 70,000 garment workers as members, and an alternate of Industrial, a global union. She's alongside her extensive and highly regarded union work, Nazma founded the Awash Foundation in 2003, which is an organization that promotes women workers' welfare. So Nazma, welcome to this conversation. We're happy to have you. I would like to ask you like a couple of questions. We would like to hear from your context and your experience how violence and harassment is being experienced by women workers in the government sector, how the successful implementation of these instruments could really make a difference, and how this instrument could also might also be important to strengthen corporate accountability regarding to women workers' rights. Before leaving the floor to Nazma, I wanted to mention that we will hopefully have some minutes for questions after our last speaker. So please take notes of your questions, that we will have some time to ask those questions to our invited speakers today. So Nazma, welcome. I will leave the floor to you now.
Viviana, and I'm apology because I forget to bring my phone, but that is why maybe some noise or some song in the hotel. So thank you. I'm in Geneva at this moment, and Industrial Global Union has the Women's Conference. For we are more than 200 women are also talking these issues, and also yesterday we adopted the Ilo Convention 90 in our resolution, so we will implementing within our union, within the different region and different countries. So we are happy. Also, even I'm in the conference, so I'm happy to talk with these issues. So, contents of Bangladesh. This convention is very, very important for us and in our region also, because in Bangladesh we don't have any abuse and harassment law. So which is very difficult for us, but only we have the High Court guideline where we can establish anti-harassment committee at the workplace. So this convention also we are fighting for few years. Even we are industrial has like a place that how to establish and gender-based violence at our union and at our workplace. So we are very much campaigning and supporting even this research when it started. We are very much closely work on this and participate until this convention adopted in the ILO. So it is very important for us because in garment sector or other sector in domestic workers in Bangladesh, because especially the informal sector, where is no rights for the women workers, so which will be very protecting our country and country women. And also the issues is migration, the migrant workers who are living for our country, for the garment sector or the different sector, especially the domestic helper when they are going to Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia, there is severe physical harassment, sexual harassment, all kind of harassment they are facing. So these the things in our union, and we are trying to make that our union in the factory level. We have the union where we are trying to establish anti-harassment committee. Also, we are trying to, when we sign the collective bargaining agreement, so we mostly talking about the gender issues and the anti-harassment and workplace harassment issues. Also signing how we can reduce this and how we establish. So and now we are trying to push our government to ratify this convention, which is very important for us to first job to need to ratify. So that is why we are trying to advocacy and lobby with our government. Also the trade bodies like Bangladesh Garments Manufacturer Association, we are also trying to promoting them to also support this convention and ratify. So this is the one thing we are trying to the policy level, and also we are trying to also push to the multinational like H&M, Inditex, Walmart, who are producing in our country within their supply chain, how they can also establish this and gender-based violence issues. And also we are talking these issues about the convention, how to establish in our production. So that's the one thing, but mainly we try to educate the workers and try to sensitize and mobilization, how we can raise our voice to ensuring these things. And we are also trying to talking with our workers, what will be the benefit, what are the things in this year, because especially the maternity protection, the daycare center is very, very gap in our country. So many of the young workers who has baby, they need to live in the countryside because of this job is not that much there is no daycare center or crash. So also the things in Bangladesh, and we are one of the cheapest labor market, so it's very easier for them to exploit the girls to giving some advantage like extra overtime, little money or whatever, and bonuses, and then they manage, the boss are taking advantage and voluntarily trying to abuse their sexually, but which is fundamentally unethical and unfair. But the girls need money and they need support. So these kind of things are happen. And also what is the gender-based violence and the sexual harassment is, people are thinking in our country, if it is severely raped or any the body touch, which is very sensitive. The things like this is the gender-based sexual harassment or abuse. But the way their behavior, the touch, the physical, verbal, all kind of things are also related with that, if which is women are not comfortable. So we are trying to sensitize. Those are the issue with our member and our female. And also we are trying to as industrial, we have like 40% women should be in our union and something in our global union. So we are trying to establish 60 to 70% female leadership within our union, and also in the factory level, and president and secretary we are trying to be in the female, because garment sector is female dominated. So if those are the leadership we increase, and those the leadership can easily to change their factory condition, and which is we found. And we have also number of collective bargaining, which is mostly the women are signing, and every CBA we putting these issues. So we are also organizing, and we try to more female leadership in the grassroots and factory level. So I think this is the way we work in the factory. And also we were trying to work in the supply chain, like tier 1, tier 2, because there is no ways, there is no maternity issues, there is severely also a lot of sexual violence and physical violence also happen. So we try both of them to sensitize, and also, but another things we are also providing legal aid support for them, because which is also very action with. So these are the issue we trying, and we mainly try to how they got the ensuring better wages also, because living wage is very important. So we are campaigning on those areas, because if the woman has better wages, better living condition, I think that could be reduced. So that is why we try to also educate their family, because it's not only the gender-based violence is only within the workplace, also it's happened their family, because many cases the intimacy partner violence also affected in their production. And also the father, the brother, and the man in the family household, they are not accept. Also the women should be raised their voice, women should be talk about the issues. So that is why we are more on try to be how we have to reduce this gap, working women and women in the work and the workplace also, because this is the big issues. And informal sector is one of the big challenging everywhere. So we are very much concentrate on those are the area how we have to work. And this convention will be one of the key tools to change our life, because which is very important. Even within the union, men are also abusing their member. So if we are sensitized, if we are aware about this issue, if we are strongly raise our thing, I think it could be changed the way we work in the grassroots, in the factory level union, and now the many factories girls are very strong to complain, because before also big challenge they cannot complain these issues because it's a social taboo and a stigma that women should not say what are the abuse they have in sexually because then men are only the society think when the women are explore and raising their voice about their exploitation, and then men always thinking the society always thinking she's a bad woman, that is why she's raised these things, the good woman should be quiet, not be raised. So these are the things we are trying to change, and we're trying to be motivated our girls, and things are moving but not that fast because we don't have the law. So if we are more in supportive the convention, which will be reduce number of things at the workplace, as even the in our community and society everywhere. So we work on this area, and also we are trying to networking with the girls and different stakeholder to how the civil society we can do. So, and also in Bangladesh we have like gender platform. We are also drafting a law how it could be the workplace harassment issues. So we are also already submit that draft law to, we have different gender platform. We've been to the labor ministry, law ministry, commerce ministry, high court, attorney, that business bodies, civil society. So everywhere we are trying to motivate these people to how we have to end gender-based violence at workplace. So this is the good things. At least now we can say that our government and motivated that we have the convention, so we have to ratify. If it is ratified, automatically we can do anything, because if any factory or anyone violated this law, then we can say the Ilo Convention 90s violence, like which is we said Ilo Convention 87, 98 when violated is severe issues. So the way we are thinking and we working, and we try to be strongly to raise, and also we have like day observation, we have doing campaign, we are put it flags, so many way we do. And because the very important issue, the how the next year the Bangladesh government can ratify. So that is why we are also maybe we have International Human Rights Day on December 10th. There will be International Women's Day, the International Labor Day. So this year and next year we do series of things. Also we will do 16 days Gender-Based Violence Action Day. So during that time we will do the different thing in our within our union, in the factory, in the different area, different cluster. Also invited men to sensitize them how important if women are getting this kind of facilities and this kind of things, it will be affected there economically. And if women are no fear and no scared, it's also benefited their things. So we are not only educated and promoting and sensitize the women, but mostly try to sensitize the men who are co-workers, are also many cases they abuse. So we are trying to more to men to be supportive, men to be helping. So this is the way now we are thinking and we work. And it's very hard to, and also it give education and awareness the factory management workers, and where we establish anti-harassment committee. So there is also we try to sensitize and establish the committee, and especially the chairperson should be women. So majority women participation from the worker side and few from the whoever, but we are giving good education and awareness also in the factory management, because otherwise we cannot do. And we do a lot of mid-level management training in the production floor where the dispute arise and the incident happen. So we found it's very important that management education is important. So, and also men, the way we do, and as well as the women. So, and also that also the UN Convention, CSW in Beijing 25 will be in next year. So which is also we are trying to work on these issues and how we have to raise the issues, what are the key issue for the violence and harassment. So now we work on that way, and we are planning very broader way. Also, we are following the Industrial Global Union because we are our global union. How we can also work with them and put pressure to the multinational and also our government and our things. We need to be not only the it's a one hand, but this is a big issue. So we work with the different platform, how we can also the women groups, the regional, local and international different women's group. Also, we are working on these issues. So I think these are the things we are working. If you have any question or something, yeah, I'm also happy to give the answer. Thank you very much.
About the situation of women workers in the garment sector, and also to share about the different strategies that you're putting in place to confront violence and harassment. So now I would like to welcome Charlene May. She's a South African attorney who has been engaged in advocacy on the right to work on behalf of community healthcare workers and sex workers. She's an ESCR-Net member as well, and she's part of the steering committee of the working group. Charlene, welcome. We would love to hear from you. How is the elimination of violence against women in the world of work linked to the enjoyment of broader women's economic, social, and cultural rights? And also how these new instruments are connected to other relevant human rights standards, or connected to other standard setting processes. I would like to ask you concretely about the current drafting process for the binding Treaty on Enterprises and Human Rights. And Maria K, you would also be very welcome to comment on that after Charlene, given ITUC's engagement in this process for the binding treaty. So Charlene, welcome. I'm leaving the floor to you now.
And impacts on the other rights that women have. And so really when we look at economic, social, cultural rights, one of the best ways to view those rights is almost to look at it as a basket. And within the basket, there's various rights contained in it. And so we're looking at issues around access to housing, issues around healthcare, the right to land, the right to work, education, is some of the examples that are all contained within this basket that makes up economic, social, and cultural rights. We, of course, know that we have various international and regional conventions that exist and that provide for us some normative content. And so what they really try and do is that they provide member states with standards and with guidance already for the realization of rights. And we have our treaty body system, of course, and they really fulfill the role of monitoring, evaluation, and as activists and people that work within civil society movements, we use them predominantly as accountability tools in respect of rights realization. In addition to that, many of the countries certainly that make up the network, they have adopted constitutions, and within those constitutional frameworks, sometimes provision is made for economic, social, cultural rights specifically. And in some of our countries, and South Africa is an example, those economic, social, cultural rights are justiciable, so you can go to court and you can seek access and rights realization through court proceedings or through litigation of those rights. But really what's important, and I think that Melissa talked a little bit about this earlier on, is the realization of economic, social, cultural rights must be done in a substantively equal manner, which means that from a feminist perspective, it means that we shine a gendered lens on it, and that we look at how the rights are actually applied and what the needs are that must be realized when we look at a rights-based framework. And what's important is that when we develop policies, when we develop laws, when we develop international conventions such as the ILO Convention or the binding treaty, that we really look at whether or not it does address the discrimination that women face and whether or not it impacts on women's rights enjoyment. And so I think that both of the last two speakers spoke and gave us very good examples of the way in which violence plays out in the professions or the workspaces that they work in and that they occupy. And the examples that we've had is the domestic workers, and we've had examples of women working in the textile industry. And so I think that when violence is present in the workplace, whether it is bullying, whether it's harassment, whether it's sexual violence, or it's any other form of discrimination, it really hampers women's enjoyment of their economic, social, and cultural rights. And as it relates to women's right to work, but also their just and favorable conditions of work. Others have reflected, as I've indicated, specific examples of the impact of the violence within their sectors. And so I just want to draw on some of those and perhaps provide us just a little bit of insight into how all of these things are connected or interconnected. And so really when violence is present, it means that depending on where women are situated, they will experience the impact of the violence and the harassment in very different ways. In respect of their access and their enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights, it may directly impact on their livelihood. And again, we've had people reflecting on domestic workers and people working in the textile and garment industry, and I think that those are professions that are not very often recognized as professions, but they're also not high income professions. Women working in the informal sector, for instance. And so if they are experiencing violence within their workplace and they are forced to leave their workplace or their place of employment, it directly impacts on their livelihood and their ability to provide for their family and people that are dependent on them for their financial well-being. We know that this is how women become trapped in cycles of poverty, and how cycles of poverty are exacerbated in that women are unable to provide for their family financially, and they're unable to exit perhaps harmful working conditions or harmful working circumstances that they find themselves in. It could also impact on women's ability to provide for their own health care, and I think that wellness and mental health issues are not issues that are often highlighted. And so when we really look at the impact, the psychological effect of violence within a workplace and women's ability to access healthcare systems, whether or not that's through private healthcare mechanisms, perhaps if their medical benefits are wholly dependent on their employment status. And then we also know that in many of our countries, our state healthcare facilities are not really able to cater to the healthcare needs of the women that make use of them. And so there is this ripple effect in terms of women being able to care for themselves. Of course, also when violence is present, women are placed in a new insecure financial position. This impacts their ability for them to look after and to educate their children. Perhaps it also impacts on women's ability to further their own education, where they are reliant on the work that they do to fund their own education system. But we know that very often women are the breadwinners within their families, and they provide for their children, especially girl children, to be able to go to school and attend school. And so school fees and girls continuing and furthering their education is normally one of the first things when austerity measures within families are taken. It's normally one of the first things that's given up, or that the family is forced to give up. If we take the scenario further, we can look at issues around social security benefits and social insurance, and very often those are directly connected to women's ability to contribute towards those schemes. and where you find yourself either unemployed because of the level of sexual harassment or violence that you've endured, or where you've been dismissed because you've complained about the sexual harassment. Very often women don't have that social security benefits on to fall back on. So the impact of violence in the workplace has harsh and severe implications for women, as it extends far outside of their workplace, and it certainly does impact directly on their economic and social standing within their home, within their community, and within their broader society. And I think that that's often something that is not taken into account, or that's not necessarily measured. And then the other issue that I was asked to touch on, and again I think some people have touched on it in this conversation already, is really the interconnectedness of the rights-based framework. And it's important to remind all of us that we have certain principles that's been set out by the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, for instance, that speak directly to equal pay for work of equal value, and that has positioned women within a very particular position within the formal and informal economy. Also, if we look at issues around the convention in particular, we've heard that it draws many of its strengths and it's the advancements that it is making from wide-ranging recognition that has already been given to women in particularly vulnerable professions, right? And so not too long ago, women, especially domestic workers, have struggled to have their work recognized as work at an international level. And so we've made some of that advances in that their work, at least at an international level, is now being recognized, and that can filter down to the domestic level. And I think Nazma gave very good examples of how within the clothing and textile industry in her country, they are planning to use the convention in order to domesticate and advocate at the domestic level. The convention, of course, also draws on the recognition that's been given to women's unpaid care work, within it shifting from a discussion around poverty. A few years ago, it was very centered around poverty and socioeconomic circumstances of women, now into a discussion that is around it being recognized as real work and the exploration of what that would mean for women. It reminds us all, of course, also, as Viviana said in the introduction to my section, that corporations and businesses need to be held accountable for the violations of rights of their employees, as well as the communities in which these businesses are situated and in which they operate. So the binding treaty provides us with a unique opportunity to look at how we can strengthen the language and how we can use it as a standard of accountability. I think what's important is to develop and to continue to build collectively on strengthening what already exists. And in the case of the binding treaty, towards the inclusion of feminist voices, so that we don't lose the gains that we have already made. We know that when we provide a safe working environment for women, that the working environment and the space becomes a safer environment for everyone. And so it's important as we enter into, I think, what has become a very hostile arena for women's rights and for feminist views, that we really look at how we can hold on to and protect the gains that we have made, and that we at the same time continue to seek avenues where we can build on and where we can expand on the protection that is being offered as we move forward towards advocacy around the ILO Convention. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
for putting on the table this very important connections on how violence and harassment obstaculize the enjoyment of interconnected women's economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, I would like to invite the speakers to jump in collective campaigns or opportunities to advance together and to unify our voices regarding to this. So I would like to give Melissa and Claribet a couple of minutes to speak about these different opportunities that they are moving forward. So Melissa, we would love if you can share with us about the global dialogue and the 16 days of activism. I will leave the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Viviana, for the opportunity to share some information about some of our campaigns, which we hope will create opportunities for all of us to connect and exchange ideas, information, more importantly, build the kind of vision that we have been talking about that we need to really operationalize the new convention as well as other standards to achieve our goals for women and other marginalized groups in the world of work. The first thing that's coming up is the Global 16 Days campaign, which many of you are probably already familiar with. It was mentioned earlier. This campaign was actually initiated by the Center for Women's Global Leadership back in 1991. And over the years, we have announced different themes. And last year, we announced the theme of ending GBV in the world of work. And our central ask for the campaign in 2018 to 19 was ILO and GBV. And now that the convention and recommendation have been adopted, it is ratify C190. So I would like to invite you to visit the website for the campaign, which was specially launched last year. It's 16dayscampaign.org. That has a lot of information about this year's theme. It has an advocacy guide, which we hope will be a useful tool for advocates and allies to very easily integrate some of the content of the convention recommendation, as well as ideas and the interlinkages that we've been talking about. We are not attempting to be prescriptive. What we are trying to do is just make it easier for everyone to integrate this ask into their work. So that's the first thing. I guess the other thing I'd like to talk about very briefly is an event called a Global Dialogue that we will be organizing in March 2020 during CSW and within the larger context of Beijing 25. This event is intended to be a space where we bring women workers, representatives of governments, member states, and businesses together to have a conversation about the new instrument within the larger framework of the new instrument, but with a focus on really pushing for ratification and also implementation. And in that process, what we plan to do is really, what we want to see happen is really to an emphasis on really a gendered approach to implementation. So we don't have a lot of time today, but I'm very happy to share written information, the concept note and other material about the Global Dialogue with all of you, because we would love for people like you to be part of that event, to bring your voices and perspectives, and of course also talk about good practices, promising practices. Like I said earlier, that we really need to exchange information about those. The last thing I would add about the Global Dialogue is, well, actually, we did an evaluation of the Global 16 Days campaign a couple of years ago, and one of the things that came out of that process was that it's not enough to raise awareness, but of course accountability is really important. So the 16 Days campaign, even though we haven't changed the name of the campaign, our intention is really to continue to work all year round in connection with the thematic issue. So the Global Dialogue is actually an example of us going from 16 to 365. So please do join us for both. The Global Dialogue will be on March 11th, and actually on the 12th we will be organizing a strategy session to talk about the ILO Convention, and also to talk about how different groups can work together and contribute to really advance this new agenda. And yeah, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Campaign, I have I have sent you the link of the campaign in the chat, so all the interested people can take a look at the campaign and join the campaign. To continue, I would like to briefly leave the floor to Claribet to speak about the women's global strike. This is a campaign that ESCR-Net is also endorsing, and we will be planning different actions around CSW, also regarding to this campaign. After Claribet, I will quickly leave the floor to Marieke, who has requested the floor. So Claribet, please share with us about the Women's Global Strike. Thank you.
Buenos días nuevamente. Yo me emociono muchísimo cuando se habla de la...
I'm very excited when it comes about the Women's Global Strike. This year it was a massive event. It was an event where you feel included, and in our case for 2020, we have yet to plan what is it that we will do to create advocacy as part of this strike. What we know is that we are present, since in this type of a movement, we need to mobilize out in the streets to demand for our domestic workers' rights, and not only for domestic workers, but for all women workers who have been stigmatized just due to their gender and the work they do. So this strike becomes an enormous opportunity for us to raise our voices on what we demand for. In the case of us Colombian women, we have no guarantees. Leader workers, we are exposed on a daily basis to violence, to the lack of respect of our human rights. And social leaders, you may or may not be familiar with the situation, but the figure of murdered leaders in Colombia has increased, and the current government lacks an effective mechanism to protect the lives of leaders at a national level. So through this Women's Global Strike, we can manifest what's happening and demand for policies that will guarantee the lives of these people. So defending populations' rights does not mean that you need to be in an afterlife. Demanding rights should allow you to defend them freely. Colombia has ratified conventions regarding union freedom, and we always see murdered leaders at different points of the country. So instruments are not enough to guarantee the protection of the lives of HRDs, human rights defenders. So these type of strikes help us to raise awareness, to be united, to defend our rights, to guarantee our rights, working under equal conditions. What we address are many issues, and that's what society hears when us women mobilize in order to demand. Lo siento, Claribet.
Conversation is and political education are very, very important to advance the implementation of the women's economic, social, and cultural rights. And around the Women's Global Strike next year, we will be having different activities in different parts of the world from those folks that are already part of the campaign. I have shared the links into the chat. I would like to leave the floor now briefly to Marieke, who has requested the floor. Also, Charlene is asking you a question in the chat. Could you please complete your update on the next steps on the convention which you started earlier in your presentation? Thank you. So, Marieke, I will leave the floor to sorry.
few words, because I think we're almost at the end of the webinar, but I just would like to say that by the 25th of November, we expect quite a lot of trade union mobilization, women in union mobilizations across the world in support of our demands for a wide ratification of Ilo Convention 190. And that will also coincide with an updated webpage, campaign webpage, and a new logo, and and other materials, which will be which are also planned throughout next year in 2020. And also for 2020, we will have several days where we will plan around actions. Like 8 March, but we can also think on the about the 21st of June, which is that's after 1 year after the adoption of ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. We are also present at the UNCSW. We are working with Melissa from CWGL on the global dialogue, and in addition to that, we will also plan some additional events around the ILO Convention 190. So we will keep you posted on that. While having referred to our public mobilization, the work we are doing, and the materials, I would also like to highlight that a lot of work on the ratification process is also happening in a silent way or in an invisible way. As you know, that as trade unions, we do a lot of lobbying and negotiating work behind the screens. So I can guarantee you that a lot of unions right now are closely in touch with governments to keep track on and to be in touch with the relevant government representatives to find out more about where they are in the ratification process, or if they are considering a ratification process. So a lot of that work is happening. Usually unions are coordinating that work. So when it comes to the ratification process, and when it comes to putting it on the agenda in the negotiations with government. So I think that was not covered yet in our webinar yet, but a lot of things are happening as well behind the screen. And again, I just want to underpin what previous speakers have said. The campaign is really a very important opportunity to build and strengthen our movement, our women's and feminist movements across the globe. And there is a lot more to say, but I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for a very interesting, strong conversation around violence and harassment against women in the world of work. Thank you to have shared some ideas for continue working in solidarity towards the ratification and implementation of this very important instrument in the objective of keep on connecting struggles and movements around this objective. So we will get you the emails of all the people in the call after the webinar. So we will be sharing the materials that were shared into the chat, and also additional materials that maybe Marieke or Melissa would like to share afterwards. So thank you very much again for joining us, and to the great speakers that we had today. We'll be in touch for a coming conversation at ESCR-Net to keep advancing a feminist vision of world of work for women.